For today's episode of Designing For, we thought we'd do something a little different. Since neither of us suffer from colorblindness, we felt that the subject of today's video would be better covered by one of our friends who is afflicted by the disorder. The script for this episode was written by him, and reflects his opinions on Link's Awakening DX and the topic of colorblindness. Say hi, Lightbear.
Hey guys, how's it going? Thank you for joining us. I'm grateful for this opportunity I had to work with my friends at Designing For. Putting this episode together took a lot of work from each of us, but it was a lot of fun figuring out what I wanted to say and how best to present it, and I think the others had fun too. I hope you enjoy this video, and have a nice day.
Alright, let's get started. Video games are an inherently visual medium. Whether the player is on an adventure, reading a story, fighting bad guys, solving puzzles, or just relaxing with a familiar task, they're almost always expected to be able to see what they're doing. But for visually impaired gamers, the ability to play a game is determined by the elements built around or in complement to the visual design. Some modern games provide solutions for blind players, with the increased emphasis on sound effects, rumble features, and other non-visual cues or mechanics letting people unable to see the screen enjoy big-name games. But there are subtler visual impairments than blindness, and these handicaps require subtler solutions. These are becoming increasingly more common too. Many games now boast colorblind modes that correct their color palette for players who'd otherwise miss visual cues. But this is a recent trend for developers. Traditionally, the subject of colorblindness has played a very minor role in designing game challenges, something reflected in the frequency of color puzzles through gaming's first 20 or so years. For many colorblind players, some games are far more difficult or even impossible to play if they base their challenges on distinguishing colors. However, this isn't always the case. For example, there's The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. For most of the game, color's pretty unimportant. Not surprising considering the game was originally released for the monochrome Game Boy. That said, Link's Awakening DX did introduce one new dungeon based entirely around color, aptly named the Color Dungeon. Taking full advantage of the Game Boy Color's revolutionary 56-color technology! All puzzles are based entirely around identifying different hues rather than any other details. So surely this means that colorblind players are out of luck, right?
Wrong!
But before we get into the dungeon, we have to talk about colorblindness. The human eye's ability to see is helped by the presence of its cones. Each eye contains millions of cones, each of which perceives one of three colors: red, green, and blue. When a person's cones are flawed or missing, that person experiences colorblindness. Complete colorblindness, achromatopsia, is actually very rare, with less than 1 in a million people who experience it. Most people with colorblindness are still able to see in color, just with a limited color spectrum. Colorblind people are usually divided into one of three types: protanopia, for red colorblindness, deuteranopia, for green colorblindness, and tritanopia, for blue colorblindness. The closer colors fall on the color spectrum, the more likely they are to be confused. This is why you sometimes hear about red-green colorblindness, but it's less likely for people to confuse red and blue. It's a point in the color dungeon's favor, then, that the two colors it chooses to emphasize are these reds and blues. They're introduced at the very beginning of the dungeon through these two color-coded checkpoint guards. They provide a simple test meant to check whether the player is using a color-capable system, which also doubles as a test of the player's ability to see in color. Red and blue are used prominently throughout the dungeon too. They're quickly established as opposites, with many of the dungeon puzzles being based around the differences between red and blue objects. The color dungeon is also one of the only dungeons in the game with more than one mini-boss. One blue and one not blue. The blue one, Giant Buzz Blob, does little to attack the player directly, but resists the player's attacks unless they use magic powder on it. The Stone Hinox, conversely, has a more aggressive attack pattern, and with all the spikes on the floor, it's easy for the player to quickly build up damage. However, the Stone Hinox is vulnerable to Link's basic sword attacks, no magic powder needed, and he has a crippling weakness to bombs, dying in as few as 2. These opposites stay consistent with the dungeon's rewards, a choice between a red tunic, which boosts Link's attack, and a blue tunic, which makes Link more durable. In this way, the dungeon uses color as a visual motif for a mechanical contrast, and smartly uses colors that almost any player can see, even if they'd normally have trouble with colors. Now, blue and red may be the dungeon's primary colors, but they're not the only ones. Different puzzles make use of other colors too, like green and yellow, but here's the kicker. None of these puzzles are very demanding physically. In addition to finding the solution, many puzzles in Zelda require a minimum level of dexterity, through time limits, things to avoid, or accuracy in their weapons. The Color Dungeon de-emphasizes these quick reflexes, letting a player who might have trouble discerning different colors take their time with a puzzle. For example, a couple of rooms feature multicolored orb monsters and holes of matching colors. The goal is to stun the orb monsters and throw them into their corresponding holes. If you get it right, the orb monster is locked in and removed from play. If you get it wrong, a sound plays and the orb monster jumps back out. Orb monsters stay stunned as long as Link is carrying them, and they'll stay stunned for several more seconds when they're sitting on the ground. Plenty of time for the player to make mistakes and work out the solution. Another element of the dungeon are these bouncy tiles, which change color and eventually disappear as Link jumps over them. These bouncy tiles show up in a couple of different rooms, but they're never a solution to the room's puzzle, just an obstacle. The player is allowed to take their time playing with them, determine their behavior, and eventually move on. If the player messes up a puzzle that uses them, that's no big deal. Just leave the room to reset the tiles and then start again from the top. Both of these examples suggest a lot of patience with the player on the game's part. This even shows up in the dungeon's end boss fight. The evil orb might have a very aggressive attack pattern, but it's also very simple, just like its solution. Attack the orb quickly until it cycles through all its colors. Whenever the boss reverts to its base color, the game notes this by telling the player to take their time. This might seem ironic since the player has to attack the evil orb quickly, but I like to think of it as a courtesy to the player. Calm down, gather your wits, try again when you're ready. Courtesy is a good way to sum up my thoughts on this dungeon. It's a dungeon that really didn't need to exist, but it was added as a fun little feature to demonstrate the Game Boy Color's new color technology. The game could have easily just run a hardware check to determine if the system could display color, but the designers thought it'd be more fun to integrate this check into the game's world with its checkpoint guards. The designers could have reused puzzles or enemies from other dungeons, but the Color Dungeon instead boasts new enemies and fun variations on existing enemies. The designers didn't have to warn the player that they'd need magic powder for the giant buzz blob, nor to tell players to take things at their own pace. But they did. A player can experience the effects of the tunics from the temporary power-ups found elsewhere in the game, and can exchange them by revisiting the dungeon, something else the designers didn't need to implement. Director Takahashi Tezuka has said that Link's Awakening exists because the developers for A Link to the Past wanted to wind down and have fun with a lighter, small-scale adventure. This is apparent in a lot of the base game's fun theming and approach to world design, so it's fun to see this element present in the remake's unique parts too. There's a great sense of patient understanding and excitement in how the world unfolds and how the player engages it. That's a great attitude to have for designing a game, especially for those who must learn to play video games differently due to physical handicaps. In the Color Dungeon's case, It could have easily been something that strictly used color as an aesthetic element. It could also been something that relied too heavily on color, alienating players who couldn't see or distinguish all the necessary shades. But instead, it finds an excellent balance between mechanics and aesthetics, using simple cues to teach the player about whatever element they don't pick up on first. Through this, it's exactly the right way to design for accessibility.